Everyone doing? Good, good. All right, well, thank you for joining me. I know you had options here, so I appreciate you stopping by. I'm curious, before I dig in, who considers himself a designer by trade? Nobody. All right, cool. Front-end developer. Okay. Two-ish, three. Back-end. Full stack. Okay. What am I missing? All right. Well, I'm Shay. I'm a mutt, quite frankly. I went to school for design. Design was interesting, but still, like, it wasn't about making things look good. It's about solving problems. That's gonna keep happening. I'm sorry. Just something. We're gonna try and get through it. Um, but design in terms of how to actually solve a problem, that led me more into engineering. And then learning how to build things become dangerous there, I realized, hey, maybe I'm just solving some of the wrong problems to begin with. That led me more into product management. And all around, just like, how do I solve different problems? So when I say I'm a mutt, I sincerely mean that in like the nicest way possible. And I'm just out to kind of solve different problems. And today I'm going to dig into front-end development, specifically front-end architectures, writing modular CSS, and finding ways to share styles across different sets of code bases and websites. So I work, generally speaking, in product-based organizations, and that is one of which you might think like we just have a website, right? So product-based, I used to work at Groupon, so you might be like, there's one website at Groupon. But I've come to find we build a lot of websites, even just within one central product. A ton of these, really. And each of those websites has its own unique, distinct purpose. They all then uniquely have their own code base. Yet they all end up sharing similar styles in CSS. And this becomes troublesome because we end up duplicating a lot of that code and taking it and stretching it. I can give you a few examples of this. So I worked at a company called Belly for a while. It's a digital loyalty rewards program. And we had an entire website dedicated to our members as well as to our merchants. And each of these sat on different code bases, which allowed us to basically build on top of them faster. We removed a lot of those back-end dependencies. However, we continually duplicated all the styles in that we wanted to share across these. We had a handful of like merchant tools as well. So we had this knowledge center and an analytics tool. And again, separate code bases that allowed us to move faster, but we continually duplicated all the styles we were using within all of these. And it didn't stop. This went on to blogs, internal tools, you name it. And as further we went, the more our styles became a mess. And for a while, I thought like this was just unique to Belly and the way we had architected our products, but it wasn't. I now work at a company called ActiveCampaign, and loosely we have the same problem. We are continually building new websites with different code bases all the time. Right now we have one for our marketing site that's a handful of static pages, and then we have a handful of even CMSs behind the scenes that power different parts of that website, be it the blog or community or education center, different CMSs almost by function of team. Inside our product then, story is no different. We have different code bases that even power different parts or features of the product. And again, like we've done this to separate a lot of the concerns and dependencies that allows us to move faster and add features and functionality easily, but we continually duplicate our styles and our assets. This gets us to a very dangerous position pretty quickly. And our styles are only getting worse, right? The more we continue to build, change, and iterate, you can begin to see this, right? We have bloated code bases with wildly inconsistent designs, and we are increasing the development friction every single day. And you know it, you can see it, as if you'd browse around the website. You'd say, hey, that page actually looks pretty good, yet wildly inconsistent from the page over here in the settings. Why is that, right? And those are different code bases, and we just happen to work on this feature latest, and we haven't updated the styles for the settings side. And it's painful. It's painful to actually go through and add a lot of these styles. And some days I show up at work and I feel like this little guy. I just ride my bike right into the pole. And almost just can't do it any better. But I feel like we can. I feel like there's a way to actually dig into this and work our way around it. So at both Belly and ActiveCampaign, we follow the service-oriented architecture, right? So it's where each code base is driven by a different set of APIs. When I say SOA, like I mean that as in a design pattern where software provides distinct functionality to other sides of the application. I'll walk through what this looks like. On one end of this, we have our databases, right? And the databases are storing all of that content, the information, whatever valuable context we need. And on the other side, we have the clients, right? These would be our front-end applications that are actually displaying a lot of that content. In between the two, we put these two services, or multiple services, if you will. And the services go out and read and write from multiple code bases, or excuse me, databases to pull this stuff together, and then populate that into the actual clients, right? And then any service could essentially change any of that data in a database, and we could see that change reflect across any of the actual clients, which is a really good position and place to be. And it's modular, it scales well, we can add or edit services as necessary, and this is like a formed good idea. But the question becomes, like, where does design fit into that as its own central service? And from a design standpoint, we have a few concerns, a few aims is what we're trying to do, right? We want modular, predictable, and maintainable code. We want to think in terms of a system, not necessarily pages, right? We want something that will scale with us, and that we're making out into components. And we want the raw assets as this comes together, right? So as we're using style sheets, be it any CSS preprocessor, we want all that stuff coming in down to like the actual variable mix-ins and like components level. We want all the JavaScript modules, we want the typefaces, the images, you name it. We want all of those common assets coming in. And we want a service to help us focus on design. So today I'm going to go through this. I'm going to go through how we approach this at Belly, how it's going to get there. Maybe. If I unplug this, will that break your recording? All right. So yeah, I'm going to go through how we did this at Belly, and how we're loosely doing the same thing in ActiveCampaign today. And we're going to start by laying some of the groundwork of like what this service actually begins to look like. And I apologize if it continues to do this. I'm trying to keep my hands like off the podium and see what happens. I found this works best in a handful of different ways, but one of which you build out this service in parallel with a real project. And this is somewhat contradictory. A lot of people like to begin with a style guide, right, and let that drive the development of any service or any website. But I've found building out a style guide first is a bit like idealistic, right? I really actually use the styles as they're defined in the style guide in the context of a real code base or product or application. So what I like to do is actually work backwards in that nature, right? One which we start with the situation of the product and work in parallel to define what is the style guide or service behind that, and eliminate a lot of the guessing work that might be involved there, and get more practical, immediate feedback. So I can walk through a bit of like how this might look. So we still have those clients out there, right? And in this scenario, we'll say a homepage and the actual style guide. Could be anything, right? I'm using homepage as an example of a code base, but it could be anything. Then we have a service, right? And that's kind of sitting in between these two. And inside that service would be all of that CSS, all of those designs. And it's sharing those out to both the homepage and to the style guide. And in terms of how this is actually built, what would happen is you'd take something that exists in that homepage, right? When you find a pattern or a component that's being reused and reshared, you abstract that and you bring it over to the service. You actually build it out in there, and then you document that into the style guide, right? So you're actually working backwards from what you might do elsewhere. And as I show this, like, keep in mind the service itself is not the style guide. The service is essentially just the source files tied to it, right? The style guide then becomes the actual UI that documents and explains what's inside the service. So you have 3 different code bases in this mix, which is a tad complicated, and it will take a little bit more effort to actually get set up and rolling. But this is like the substantial part of getting this done, so that any change later that happens inside that service propagates across all of the clients, right? So if we were to go in there and change our font sizes or color, we see that change then reflected across all of those clients, those user interfaces. Now, the service itself could be a number of different things, right? So it could be a Node or Python package, it could be a Ruby gem. The most important part there is like figuring out what's actually going to work best inside your environment. I've done it a handful of different ways and continually think about how to do it in a scenario to where it will scale well too. So if we're building out different types of code bases inside that service-oriented architecture, what's going to be the best one where design and like CSS fits into that, and how can we continue to let that grow and scale? In this case, I'm calling the service Rolodex. It's just a name I gave it, like a Rolodex of styles you kind of want to pull out. This is what it might begin to look like. You might have this master like Rolodex CSS file that's kind of concatenating all of the files within it, and then that is imported into those clients themselves. And we'll get a bit deeper into the weeds of like what this stuff begins to look like, but I think this starts to give you a picture of what that could be and where all those essential source assets are coming in from a variable mix-in and utility component level. So once we have all this kind of connected, digging into that CSS specifically, the first thing we do is basically break down some of the base styles we have. And the way I've done this is to use Normalize CSS as a jumping point. So you take Normalize and you start to break that out into multiple files and folders. The first two that come to mind very quickly are just your general layout and typography styles. Outside that, you start to get deeper into the components. And essentially starting with forms, media, and tables. Again, using Normalize CSS to kind of set the frame of what this is. And you place these into these files and folders accordingly, and everything is then sitting inside of a MasterRolodex folder at this point, and specifically doing that to prevent collision from other files or folders inside of a code base. So keep in mind this file here is that MasterRolodex file that will be imported into all these other code bases. What we don't want is a file that it may exist already in that code base to then collide, right? And then which it can't actually be read or is overwriting something else. So we've namespaced these all inside the actual Rolodex folder to make sure that that does not happen. And this is that master file that concatenates all those together. When we have that kind of like base level down, we start to think more about the actual settings that come into play here. So this could be the variables and maps. It could be the mixins or utilities, specifically getting deeper into what are like the colors, the grid, and typography behind some of those central components that will continue to be reused and shared. Similar to that MasterRolodex.css file, we have one for settings. And this specifically is going to concatenate, all of those settings files, right? Again, we're organizing these into variables, mixins, and utilities. And in this order specifically, the cascade here does matter. One of which we want those variables to be available inside the mixins, and want mixins to be available inside the utilities. And utilities then themselves could be functional CSS, things that are within. And we'll walk through a bit of what this could be and how it will play out as well. You take that settings file and you place it at atop the Rolodex master file. Again, the cascade's important here because we want all of those settings to be available inside the components and other things we begin to build. So we're paying key attention to what that cascade actually becomes. As we start to go through this though, the essentials start to come in place, right? We start to build out and add more components as we go through this. And the key thing I always tell people is like only add components into this when you're ready. It's very easy to think about what are our tooltips going to be, how should we do our modals, what should forms be. And again, you start to take that mindset of documenting or building something that could be idealistic, right? So I wait until we actually have a need for one of those and it exists inside that real code base and we find the pattern and then abstract it. And you can't force this to happen. You can't try and jam everything into that style guide or code base on the onset. You really let it fill itself out. And you have to iterate, right? You're gonna have to iterate and change some of that as you go through, as you learn how things are used in different settings. But it's a far smarter way than trying to force it from the onset. And here's what this could look like, right? Here's what this folder begins to kind of expand itself in and some of the key components you're gonna see come in. Again, you're gonna heavily refactor these as you begin to grow. But each of these aiming for reusability and predictability around what you're doing. And you just rinse and repeat this process where you continually optimize and improve what you have. And it's core that you kind of get comfortable with this because you're going to be doing this quite a bit. And the component side is where you're going to spend probably the majority of your time. Less on the actual settings. When the settings are in place, it's rare that you actually change those. The components, you will continually find new ones. You'll continually find patterns and spend a lot of time actually building these out. Make sense so far? All right. So let's dig into the actual implementation. I think that first part is really hard, like sincerely hard. And it takes a lot of time. I recently just did it with the team and I forgot like how difficult that could be. But once done, the rest of this gets more fun, frankly. This is where some of the interesting stuff comes into play. So keep that in mind during implementation. If you find yourself struggling to get through some of that initial work, that's okay. Hold tight, you're gonna make it. And this stuff is what gets pretty interesting. So as we dig in, we're out to break our CSS into these very small modules, right? The smaller that module, the more maintainable it ideally is. Thus, we will follow the single responsibility principle, right? That of which our styles are independently created and encapsulated. Those modules should do one thing only, and one thing really well. And if we do that right, it allows us to combine those modules together, right? We have small modules, we can place them together and get more combinations of styles. So let's take a look at what some of this could be. So here we have an alert, but this alert's not great. A lot of the styles are bound together. It doesn't allow this alert to be reused with different types of alerts. Here specifically we have what would be an error, right? So you could see a red background a red color. And this is not independently created, not independently encapsulated in what this is. This is not exactly what we want to do. Instead, we'd rather break these styles apart, right? We take those shared styles and abstract them. So we have a module specifically for the alert, that of which is going to bring in that border radius and padding, and those would be the styles that are applicable to all the alerts we have, be it an error, a success message, a warning, general information. And we actually take the error itself, more of that would be the visual aesthetic to it, and pull that out, right? That becomes its own module. And here they each follow that single responsibility principle, where they're completely encapsulated. They're smaller modules themselves, thus they have become more reusable. And they can be combined with other modules for different results, right? Such as that success message or warning. At the same time, we don't want to let the HTML dictate the structure of our CSS either. We're out to write the selectors for reusability, right? We want to make the selectors we're writing far more efficient. And we want to build components to be used wherever, right? And interchangeably throughout the product or code base we're in. And as such, we need to think about parent container dependencies and removing them, and allowing elements to change along with semantics, and ensuring that we have as few CSS overrides as possible. So here, we have this featured box, right? And on its own, it has a gray background, but when used inside of an article, we want to change that background to a white background. Isn't great in the sense that we're actually overriding those styles, right? So that's more work for the browser to actually have to figure out and process to do. The bigger problem that becomes, what if article is not the right element for the job, right? What if that needs to be switched out to be a section or something else? We're stuck having to make a change both in the HTML and the CSS, right? And that's not exactly where we want to be. And this doesn't allow the context to change with the semantics of the page. So not great. Instead, we could just use a new class, right? We could use a new class, branch from the original. Here we don't override any of those properties, right? We let them stand on their own. It's far more modular, and we've removed the entire parent container dependency of what this begins to look like. Another example of this, and where you might see this more often, is actually around typography, right? So here we have an H2 that is coupled to its parent. When an H2 lives inside of a featured box, we want it to be orange. We want it to have, this type of font size and family. But what happens when H2 is not the right element for the job, right? We want to switch that out to be an H1 or an H3, or maybe it's just a paragraph in general, right? These elements can't change necessarily with the semantics of the page without having to change the HTML and the CSS at the same time. And this thus then limits the number of elements we can apply these styles to. And traditionally what you're going to see is people then will inappropriately use the semantics of the page, right? They'll start making these things H2 despite not necessarily needing to be an H2, right? Just to ensure that they get the styles to come through. So this is not where we want to live. Instead, we could use a class here, right? Where we don't couple those styles to the parent. We allow that to change and adapt with any of the semantics tied to this. We're thinking far more about the system of this and the performance tied to that. And we're being very intentional with how we structure and build out these selectors. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about naming though, either. It's hard, always has been, always will be. You may follow what would be like BEM, SMAX, OO, CSS. There's a handful of different ways you can kind of write these names. I think first and foremost, you write them to be developer friendly, right? You make them understandable to one another. Classes inherently don't have a lot to do with semantics, so write them for yourselves and where you'll actually understand them. Ideally, those are functional names, right? They're based off the function, the meaning or context of what the element is, not the actual visual appearance of it, right? Knowing that that visual appearance can change, we want it to be more functional than not. And we also want to strive for predictable patterns around what this could actually be. So here we have some unrecognizable class names. Does anyone want to guess what PR might be? Pull request? Here, I'm going to give you some socks. Yeah. See? You got to participate. Pull request. All right, what else could it be? Public relations is one, okay. Print, did I hear print? Okay. Puerto Rico. Good, good, okay. What's UN then? All right, hold on. We'll give you some socks too. Okay. Please. It's true, but please do. All right, what else could UN stand for? Underlined, okay. It's tricky. These names aren't inherently just known. They're also pretty deeply nested, right? So you can't take UN outside of PR. Theoretically, like the United Nations is not leaving Puerto Rico in this in this example. But the specificity here will grow too, right? Specifically over time as we're trying to target deeper into those elements to make changes, that specificity is only going to grow, right? So we've really reduced any ability to make these styles portable. This is not what we're after. It's price and unit. No one's ever guessed, to be quite honest, about what those are. Here we have better names, right? We've set them at the same strength. They don't compete on a specificity level, so there's no increase there. And they're far more modular, far more performant. You can move unit in or outside of a price. It doesn't matter, right? And you can reuse these styles where you want, where needed, where necessary. So you're in a far better position of what this could be. We also want to be predictable, though, too, right? Here are the class names for our buttons. Nothing new, nothing special. These are fairly standard, I'd say, core functional class names. But when it comes to these styles of our alerts, we want those to be predictable, right? So you can see that they follow a very similar pattern, right? Also very functional in nature. To no surprise, we also follow that with our labels too, right? Making sure that none of this really comes as a surprise. It's fairly predictable and you understand what this is. And these examples are inherently simple. It gets far harder, far more difficult. You start to think about how do you use scales, whether you use numbers or phonic alphabets, things like that. There's a lot of different ways you could then begin to name things, but focus on using predictable patterns where possible. And stay focused. And just keep it as simple as possible along that way. Who uses Sass by chance? Anybody? A few of you? Or any general CSS preprocessor? Okay, cool. I'm going to speak about Sass for a minute. I'm a big fan and proponent of Sass because I think it allows you to get a lot more done with a lot less code. One of the core things I use is mixins. Specifically, mixins allow us to share common declarations of styles. But with these mixins, they also should too follow that single responsibility principle, right? That mixin should do one thing only, one thing really well. That mixin should be independently created and encapsulated as it works. So here we have the image replacement technique, right? This is the perfect mixin in that these styles we may want to use quite often inside of that code base. Thus, we group them together inside this mixin, and when they are placed inside the logo, as this compiles out, you see all those styles come into play with what this is. Very simple, very easy way to kind of share these styles and ensure that we keep them consistent and maintainable as we continue to grow. Mixins also allow arguments, which is very handy as well. And we can create dynamic sets or groups of these styles. So here you see we have this box outline and we pass in a variable for that border color, right? And in this scenario, we're saying we want that to be blue. When we compile this out, we can see that it takes all of those styles, drops them in here, and selected that blue border color for us, which is perfect. It's a great way to share common sets of styles. It makes composition of these far easier while also keeping them consistent, which is exactly what we're after in this scenario. We also can use maps then too. And maps essentially allow us to get a lot more done with a lot less code, especially when we're talking about creating utilities or different components. So if you're using functional CSS, there's a great way to use maps to generate a lot of those functional classes. And then specifically when you're creating components that have themes or groups of themes, you can use maps to generate a lot of those as well. And one edit to a map could then change a lot of traditional output of what that is. We'll take a look. I keep my maps alongside the variables. As such, I'll use an SCSS file, not specifically an SASS file, because I want those styles to actually allow line breaks, so I can actually read the map rather than trying to put that all in one line. But here, for legibility, I've done that. I use variables defined outright and then inside a map because I want the variables, if I want to just say green somewhere, let me use green. Don't let me use like a get map function to have to go select it out of the map. Like I want it in both places for a bit more functionality and modularity. But inside here, we're using an each loop to basically go through every line of that map and generate a specific class for that, right? So as we start to think about functional CSS and where that could come in and play. And compiled out, you can see here we get a class specific to each color we want inside that, right? So we could take this idea and blow it out as we start to think about more functional CSS. As we add new lines to that map, we get a lot more styles and powers to it. We can do this on a component side as well. So here I have a larger map with a handful of nested lists inside of it. And each loop actually iterates through every line of the map and will generate different alert styles for us. So we could do this with alerts, we could do it with buttons, we could do it with labels, anything that has like a core group of these. And when we compile this out, excuse me, you can see where those values begin to come in and play. And if we ever wanted to add a new theme or component to this, all we have to do is add one line to that map, which is pretty nice. So, a few final thoughts as we roll into this. We want to enjoy design without hassle, right? We want the ability to maintain that code for it to be predictable. And we want to do this without much of a learning curve. So I have a few final thoughts. One is, this is complicated, right? So let's not overcomplicate this as much as possible. One of the easy ways I found to do this is I like to just write things out longhand, first and foremost. Honestly, as it will be compiled out. And then I refactor. I look for the areas of where things are reused, where I could begin to break down those modules into smaller ones. And I don't try and start there. Like, my mind just doesn't work that way. If I see it and I can like start to think about it and roll through it and refactor it, I can really get it back into the modular side. But if I try and know that at the forefront, rarely do I actually get there, frankly. So I always start at the end and work backwards. So you have to have patience, though. You have to refactor and change willingly throughout that. I leave a ton of comments and document what I'm doing, the who, what, why, where, what's going on in the code, and anything that isn't obvious. At first I didn't love the idea of leaving comments because it made me slower. But frankly, it also makes me think a lot more inherently around what I'm doing. And I actually refactor code more often than not by leaving a comment and being like, wait, why would I do that? Hold on. To actually have to write that out, right? And use words to articulate something, it makes me stop and think, no, I think there's a better way to actually do this. So while it slows me down, I think it also makes the code substantially better. And obviously everyone else in the team can actually see what's going on. I commonly do this in SassMeister or in CodePen. I like to find a sandbox to go play in, right? So to try and do this, honestly, in a development or production environment, I find those environments actually weigh me down a little bit. And I start to think more about that environment than I do about what I'm actually trying to get done. And if I take it outside that environment for a minute, I can be in my own little playground for a minute and find ways to do this without being too concerned about what else is going on. And then outside of internal feedback, I go to the community quite often. The community is there in a heartbeat. I just post a tweet, I share links, and people, they get involved. Our work is hard and frustrating, but it's also incredibly fun and rewarding. So I think the more we support each other on this stuff, the far better we'll be as a group too. And then when you're changing your styles, as you're getting into this, measure your improvements. So I would do quite a bit of inventory and profiling of the code I was putting together and set a baseline of core KPIs we were after, right? So what do we actually want to improve? I'd use stylestat to do a lot of this, and web page test for a high level overview, that of which would be far more quantitative. And then CSS, and CSS lint gave me the qualitative side of that, right? For more specific optimizations around what we could change. And I can't recommend actually profiling your code enough. Gives you a good idea and understanding of what you're changing, where you're having an impact, and where you can really uncover more optimizations. So I'll share a few of these. This is for a project at Belly specifically. So V1, frankly, is what we were doing using Bootstrap and everything it took us to overwrite Bootstrap. V2 is when we built that out and moved over to our own service. And huge improvements across the board here. File size was our core KPI. That's what we really wanted to impact and change. We knew if we could get file size down, we had more consistent code, more maintainable, more controllable code on our end. But through this, we decreased a lot of the rules, the selectors, and unique values. We felt really good about this. The property counts, honestly, were trending in the right direction. But as we played around with it, we knew that these would fluctuate, right? As we were actually editing the code and iterating through things, that these would grow and change. And while not perfect, we could see we were on the right track and pretty excited about that. So, do the best you can, right? You gotta find your way to benefit from modular, predictable, maintainable code. I think put the focus on actually shipping, understanding and controlling your code. And if you can do that, you'll find a way to improve your designs and find far more ease in your development practice. So start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. Like this guy, you just got to cut loose, enjoy your work. So that's what I have. Thank you. Questions? I think we have a couple minutes. Start here.
Are there any goals for turning an existing website back
I don't. There are? Okay. So you'd put in like compiled, and it would give you like Sass out of it. All right. Can you share one? Do you know one offhand? Okay. Please. I'll give you some socks too.
Are you posting your slides anywhere?
Yeah, for sure I can. I'll tweet about them. I was supposed to tweet.
Cool.
Yep.
Would you recommend using any like grid framework, or do you find those yourself?
Yeah, I go back and forth honestly. I'm too anal. I just build my own. Um, and I think it's far different of a conversation today than it was even a year or two ago. Frankly, as we have like the grid spec, Flexbox, things like that. I think we're all in pretty good shape. And that like we're also using relative measurements for most of this rather than like at the fixed grid we're using years ago. So like today, honestly, I build my own. That would have been a different answer 5 years ago, but yeah. Yes.
Is there any way to find your own libraries if you want to style a site, like an existing site?
Say that one more time. I'm sorry.
As in, are there any sites where somebody has looked at a public site, like
Mm.
say BuzzFeed, copied their style, and then put it publicly, so someone might make a clone site that looks like it, but
I don't know specifically of any like if you wanted a copy of like a specific site. There's certainly plenty of like themes out there, right? So you could go find Bootstrap themes.
Sass or something.
For sure. Yep. Yep. I would just Google it. I don't like there are Bootstrap themes. There are functional like CSS themes. A lot of which will give you like the source like Sass files to it. Much like you could download like a WordPress theme and get that running, you can do a lot with just general website themes too. Hmm. If you Google like functional CSS or like modular CSS themes, I think you'll find a handful quite well. If you get into like the functional land, there's different libraries. If you do like functional CSS libraries, I think the most popular one's Tachyons, which is pretty nice. But it's keep in mind inherently not like a theme. It's just going to be a format of stuff. You still have to kind of go in and customize it yourself to get it into the colors and styles and design you want. Yes.
Would you recommend having a separate HTTP server of like styles.belly and then all your services reference that for your CSS, or do you distribute
Yeah. So the
style of CSS and then each
yeah.
service gets their own copy?
Like
So
yeah, so style.bellycard.com would actually be the style guide that is the documentation library of the service. The service itself, when we built it out, we built it, this is not smart, but both as a Ruby gem and a node module inside the same code base. I wouldn't do that this way, which we have in an active campaign. We've just straight up built it out as a node module. And we're using Docker to basically build our environments. So it comes into the development process from a Docker standpoint, but in it, the code base itself is written as a node module. Does that make sense?
yeah.
So, cool. All right. Well, thank you all.